Welcome to the HR strategy module. This is the one. This is the one that tries to encapsulate everything else we do in HR and learning and development. And all of the other modules in this series, in effect, are subordinate to this module. Because if you want to be a true professional, then a true professional has an HR strategy and a learning strategy to work to. Now, if you ask any HR director whether they have an HR strategy, generally the answer will be yes. If you ask them to be more specific and say what exactly is the HR strategy comprised of, then the answers become a little bit more vague, and often we hear about policies and procedures more than we hear about strategy. So this module, its main aim is to pin down what an HR strategy really means, both in conceptual terms and also in practical terms. Now, one other key point here, there is no such thing as an HR strategy that exists in a vacuum. An HR strategy has to be an integrated part of the overall business strategy, and in fact I tend to refer to it now as HR business strategy. They are one and the same. Whoever devises the business strategy has to take on board the people implications if the organisation is going to manage this human resource, this human capital, to best advantage, to best competitive advantage. The other key thing that we're going to look at in this module is where we position HR and learning and development to a certain extent, but mainly HR on this particular module. And so if you are working as an HR director, an HR manager or an HR business partner, we're going to look at a thing called the HR maturity scale to see exactly where a strategic partner sits in the organisation, and this has serious implications for the role and function of the HR team, the HR department. Certainly over recent years, the development of HR business partners has been based on the idea that HR needs to move away from transactional work, the day-to-day work of HR administration, and get much more involved in the way the business or the organisation actually runs itself. Okay, let's have a look then at what HR strategy really means and maybe where your role fits into this overall strategic framework. This is the HR strategy module. We're going to look at HR strategy from several different angles. First, we'll ask the question, what exactly is HR strategy? Then we'll ask the opposite, which is what isn't HR strategy? We'll look at principles and how they underpin strategy, and how Toyota enshrine people principles in their business strategy. We then move on to HR maturity, and we finish by looking at how businesses predict the future. So what exactly is an HR strategy? Well, we have to take a step back first, because we need to make sure there is a business strategy in place. And a business strategy has a purpose of giving the organisation a competitive advantage. In fact, if organisations didn't have competitors, they wouldn't need a strategy. They'd be quite happy with an operating plan. An HR strategy, though, turns the way you manage your people into a competitive advantage. Basically, it says you can manage your people better than the way other organisations manage their people. So in this sense, an HR strategy can be seen as a business strategy in its own right. If an organisation already has the same technology as its competitors, has the same access to capital, is in the same markets, and in fact if all the other factors between the two organisations are the same, then literally the organisation is only left with one alternative, and that is to manage its people better than its competitors. Strategy is a subject that's almost as old as civilization itself, and the dictionary definition tends to concentrate on the art of war, strategy as a war weapon. It's about managing people or armies in a campaign. It's about moving troops into favourable positions. This definition can be read straight across into modern organisations. So let's have a look at what the key elements of an HR strategy might look like with this in mind. First, as we've already established, there must be a business strategy, although as we move on we'll find that HR strategy and business strategy should be one and the same. HR and business strategies must be completely entwined. They can't be separate entities. And HR itself must focus on the same measures as the business. It should not look internally at its own measures of efficiency. And strategic HR thinking has to be represented at a strategic level. If there isn't somebody with a strategic HR hat on at the board or at least the executive level, then it's unlikely that effective HR strategy will be developed. Any self-respecting HR director would say that they have an HR strategy. But in practice, what they really mean usually is they have a collection of personnel policies. But a collection of policies does not in itself mean that you have an HR strategy. An HR strategy really has to be a plan to manage organisational change. Organisational change and HR strategy are almost synonymous. It has to be directly integrated with strategic business objectives. It doesn't react to or even respond to business change. It is integral to business change. Therefore, it tends to be all about a new design for the organisation, a conscious design for the future, to make the organisation as adaptable and as flexible as possible to meet whatever competition it's ever likely to meet. And when all that is done, then it does actually become a basis for developing HR policies. But the policies come from the HR strategy, they do not comprise it. So HR strategy, in a nutshell, is all about competitive advantage. And to gain that competitive advantage, you have to move your people into the most favourable positions. But it's also inherently about change. Having to have a competitive business strategy means that you are always trying to stay ahead of the competition. And so change is inevitable. And it's how we manage that change which is a key part of HR strategy. One of the big problems though with change management is that people don't like to change too much generally. We like to get into our comfort zone, and we like to have a bit of routine, and we like to know what's expected of us every day. We don't particularly take to uncertainty and not being sure what the future holds. So in times of change, what do people hang on to? Well, what the organisation should really be doing is being clear about the principles that it follows. Because even in times of upheaval and change, if the organisation can show that it is sticking to its core principles, that tends to reassure people, because we all have principles that we live by, and if we don't feel we have to change our principles too much, we tend to go along with this transition and the change required, because it isn't actually changing anything fundamental in the way we go about running our lives. So let's have a look at how important this question of principles is in HR strategic thinking. You might think that HR strategy is all about delivering strategic business objectives, and obviously that is its main goal. But what it's really trying to do is build the foundations for a very effective organisation, and the most solid foundations are the principles that the organisation wants to follow, and that includes every individual employee, because a principle is defined as a fundamental truth or law. It's something that people use as their guide to their personal conduct, the code that they follow in their lives. And if a strategy is going to be built on principles, then these principles should be simple to understand and easily expressed, so that anybody in the organisation knows really what they are and what they mean. So what sort of principles should an HR strategy be based on? Well, here are some examples, although the list is probably endless. How about honesty is the best policy? Do you want all of your employees to be honest? We'd assume that we would. How about treating everybody as a unique individual rather than a job grade or some job evaluation unit score? What about the fact that all HR solutions must be aligned with business objectives? Would that rule out some of your current HR practices? And all activities, shouldn't they all add value? If an activity doesn't add value, then why are we doing it? How about an evidence-based approach to management, and particularly to people management? What evidence do we have that we are managing our people well? And also the basic concept of measurement preceding management. If you don't measure, you can't manage. And more recently, organisations have had to consider the ethical side of their business. Is it an ethical organisation? Do people feel they have to follow an ethical code? And there are probably many, many more that you might like to consider. But any organisation should be absolutely clear the principles on which it is based. We can easily see that principles underpin our everyday behaviour. And another word that we now need to introduce is the word values. Our principles and our values are very, very closely aligned. For example, I might value open, honest communication if I work in an organisation, but does everybody value that? Would a senior manager that you might have to work with welcome you being open and honest in your views about the way they were running a department or a function, or even their relationships, if you like, with other departments? So whilst we might want a principle of open and honest communication because we value it, if people don't have the same values, don't share the same values, then the principle will mean nothing to them. It will just become almost like a policy statement that we want to have an open sort of organisation where we can say what we think to each other without fear of retribution. So you cannot talk about principles without understanding that they are underpinned in turn by our innermost innate values, the things that we really do value in our lives, the things that we actually think are very, very important. And of course, as soon as we start talking about personal and organisational values, we can move into areas like employee engagement. To what extent are our employees really engaged with the values and the principles of the organisation? Now, one organisation that has enshrined some very solid principles in its way of working for many, many years is the Toyota Motor Corporation. And we need to look at the experience at Toyota in some detail. Toyota provides a fascinating case study and was established as a business, or at least its automotive business, back in 1937, so it's been going for quite some years. But in fact, at that time, it was already 20 years more behind the big American companies like General Motors and Ford, and it had a lot of catching up to do. But even from the very, very early days, it established what principles it would be working to. And a book written by one of the founding family members was written in 1987 after 50 years of Toyota being in business. And many of the principles at Toyota are covered in this book. But the author, Eiji Toyoda, did not actually write this book just like a textbook. It was really just the way Toyota works. So sometimes you have to read between the lines to find out what really makes an organisation tick. And picking up the principles that are behind the success of Toyota is quite tricky. So let's have a look at some of these principles in detail. One organisation that is built on very, very solid principles is Toyota and the Toyota Way. There was a book written by one of the family founding members called Eiji Toyoda, who helped to start the business in 1937 and wrote a book 50 years later on the story of Toyota. And in this book we can read between the lines to understand the sort of people principles that Toyota follows. There is no chapter in this book called the people chapter. It runs through the whole of the book. So for a start, the fact that it has some simple solid principles is one of the people dimensions, so that everybody can understand what the organisation is all about. One key principle for the managers is Genchi Genbutsun, which means go see for yourself. Managers cannot sit in their office, they have to go and see what's actually happening out there in the operation. Toyota's Kaizen philosophy, continuous improvement, is the one thing they're really famous for, and most organisations these days would say they follow a philosophy of continuous improvement. They are obsessed with making sure that what they deliver is fit for purpose and fit for the purpose of the customer. The customer dictates everything they do. They follow the plan, do, check, act cycle, and if you do the toolkit module, you will understand what the plan, do, check, act cycle is. They're obsessed with growth, and even though more recently they may have to reduce in size, they see growth as absolutely critical to the way they manage their organisation and the way they manage their people. They also look after their supply chain and make sure their supply chain partners have a really constructive, positive relationship with the organisation. They always require open book accounting from their supply chain. They want to make sure that the supply chain companies are making good profits, but any benefits they get they share with Toyota. They have a crystal clear psychological contract with all their employees. If you work for Toyota, you're expected to use your brain at work. You are meant to come with ideas. You are constantly looking for improvements. In return, you should have very secure employment in a very, very good organisation. Although they have union relationships, it is built on a non-confrontational approach to employee relations. They tend not to seek to blame people. They know that the best organisations, the most innovative organisations, are those where people work together and make mistakes, but learn from those mistakes rather than blame each other. They tend to support the idea of lifetime employment, even though that's increasingly difficult in a modern globalised context, and that's why they nowadays use casual labour in the short term before they give them full-time permanent employment. They use double loop learning, and this is also included elsewhere in the Consummate Professional series. And they're also into whole system thinking, and again the whole of the Consummate Professional series is based on the idea of systems and system thinking. These are really rock solid principles by which any organisation could be organised. There's no such thing as a perfect organisation, and Toyota isn't perfect, but it's the best example of a very large organisation I've ever come across in my career, where they actively, consciously try to integrate their philosophy of managing people with their business philosophy. And this is a very, very complex picture, which probably explains why there aren't more great case studies. There are organisations that seem to manage their business well and seem to have good ideas about managing people, but I haven't found one that is better than Toyota. But Toyota isn't perfect. It has recalls like most automotive companies. But we're not going to take a snapshot or a short-term view of any organisation's approach to people management and HR strategy, because this is inherently a long-term game. And so now we need to look at the role of the professional HR strategist, never mind the role of the professional HR business partner, in terms of helping the organisation accept managing people is always a long-term game. And we're going to look at something called the HR maturity scale, which I developed over 15 years ago and have been refining ever since, and I teach it on my MBA program. And most HR people, in fact most organisations, seem to identify with this scale. And really it's about bringing a professionalism to HR strategy that says to the organisation, let's grow up a bit, let's mature. Let's all think again about how we manage people and how we get the best value out of everybody. This is probably the most complex slide I've ever produced. It is called the HR Maturity Scale, and it looks at how organisations view people management. The scale has two ends. At the left-hand side we have low value activity, and at the right hand side of the scale we have high value activity. At the left hand side, organisations tend to have a very immature view of what people management is all about. All they really require is personnel administration, a very reactive role. As they start to grow up, They realise there is something called personnel or HR management. And over time, their views on HR and people management are challenged. We tend to talk these days now about human capital, but there is a big barrier to organisations understanding what human capital really means. And the executive teams often fail to realise just what the true value potential is of human capital. This is a barrier to developing the maturity of organisations in terms of their people management thinking. Once they get over this barrier, we tend to be in the true world of human resource management. And if we keep moving along this scale, we get to a stage where the organisation really does think strategically about its human capital. So we might talk about human capital management strategy. Now this is a journey of evolutionary steps, developmental steps. And an organisation that doesn't really think about how it manages its people at all would be at stage 0. There is no conscious attempt to manage people in any particular way. It's just intuitive gut reaction management. To move to stage 1 on this scale, an organisation at least has to have a personnel administration function. Whether that's a department called personnel or not is another matter. But this function is about basic administration, making sure the payroll is run properly. It should be able to tell the organisation the numbers of people employed, and it should have some idea of the costs involved in personnel administration. This is a very, very limited view of what people management is all about. So most organisations these days will have moved on to stage 2, where they want and expect good professional practice. So they tend to employ people they would regard as professionals. And an HR professional would put things in place like recruitment and selection systems and rudimentary performance review processes. So in other words, they would help the organisation hopefully recruit the right people, and once those people are on board, the performance process would check that they're performing to the required standard. This is a sort of basic minimum level of professionalism. Some organisations have been pushing out along this scale, probably for many years, and they tend to move towards stage 3, which is what they really need, is effective HR management. At stage 2, the professional HR person, who may be professionally qualified, give advice to the line managers, but that advice might be ignored. To move to stage 3, the line managers have to value the expertise of human resource management professionals. And systems start to have some teeth. So the rudimentary performance review process, which may just have gone through the motions of reviewing people's performance on a regular basis, to get to stage 3, that would have to have teeth. In other words, underperformers would have to be managed out of the organisation, and even good performers would have to be managed in the sense of improving their potential and making sure that any talents they have are fully utilised by the organisation. Then we hit up against the brick wall. The executive have to really understand that there's much more to managing people than having professional advice and even systems that start to make a bit of a difference. So to get past this wall, we need to move towards stage 4, where the executive understand that human resource management has to become integral to business operations. So for example, when the organisation is thinking of recruiting to fill vacancies, the HR input would not just be there to provide expertise and a recruitment process to make sure people get recruited. It would actually ask fundamental questions about redesigning the organisation first. Why do these vacancies exist? What are the strategic objectives of the organisation that have led to these vacancies existing? And if we do reorganise in any way, what are the implications for the rest of the organisation? So we need HR business partners to fulfil this role at stage 4, who really understand the business. And at this stage, the organisation is getting mature enough where line managers accept that HR business partners will be intervening in their own management role. But maturity means that they would welcome and accept this. They would not fight against it. They may well fight against the idea of business partners, if only at stage 3 or even stage 2. And the other thing that starts to happen now is that business measurement systems start to look at people measures. which is why two of the modules in this series look at this problematic question of how do you put people measures in place in an organisation. Once an organisation has got to stage 4, it can start to move on, but there is this transition phase where it goes from still looking very much at an operational approach to human resource management towards a much more strategic approach, a strategic focus. That means that the whole organisation has to focus on maximising value through people, the sort of thing that Toyota does very well. The organisation cannot afford to be complacent. It wants to get the best value out of everybody it can. And again, it will only do that if the organisation has created an environment where people actually want to give of their best and can give of their best. And the final stage on this continuum is stage 6, where the organisation is so mature it becomes a complete system, and everybody understands that it's a complete system and works to this complete system. So for example, the system requires that everybody shares their knowledge, but it has created a culture at this stage so that people want to share their knowledge. If people don't want to or can't share their knowledge, then their own intellectual capital is not being managed very well. But people always still need to learn. So the organisation's approach to learning is that everyone is an individual, and we don't send people on sheep dip or scattergun training courses. We enable them to learn at their own pace in their own preferred style. Stage 6 represents a very, very mature organisation and a very, very high performing, very effective organisation. Okay, so whether this is your first introduction to the maturity scale or not, the first question that you need to ask yourself is, where are you and where is your organisation on this maturity scale? And the brick wall roughly in the middle, which suggests that the executive don't fully understand what HR strategy is all about and certainly don't articulate how much value they're expecting from the people side of the organisation, is quite a thick, strong brick wall, and you will meet up against a lot of resistance. The more you try and become professional in this, the more you try and move the organisation forward, the higher the probability is you're going to meet up against resistance. It's worth realising, though, that this is the norm. The resistance is the norm. It would be a very unusual organisation if there was no resistance at all. People generally don't warm to change. There might be a few of us who enjoy change and bringing about change in organisations, but generally I think it's true that most people resist change, and that goes right through to the most senior levels. So really the maturity scale is not about telling people what to do or dragging them along. It's about an education process which says, actually, whether you're a line manager, whether you're an employee at any level, whether you're a senior manager or an executive, what the maturity scale really says is, this is in your best interests. You will find doing your job easier and more satisfying by bringing the people along with you. And understanding that maturity requirement is what this is all about. So this is not about forcing anybody to do anything. It's about better relations within the organisation. And I think what the true professional HR strategist does is try and bring about better relationships in organisations. Now, one way that you might use to reduce the level of resistance at the most senior levels is to start to talk to the executive or even the board about what the future really holds. Because business strategy, as much as HR strategy, has to try and predict what the future holds and tries to come up with the best plans possible to cope with whatever the future holds. So the next slide is really just a simple technique, a very obvious technique, on how we can use predictions of the future of the business to link to looking at the implications for the way we manage people in the future. Any organisation that wants to stay in business for the foreseeable future has to predict what the future holds. And this is a simple chart that puts this into practice. On the y-axis, we have measures of organisational performance. It could be market value, market capitalisation, it could be profit, it could be any one of those key organisational indicators. And on the x-axis, we have a view over 10 years. Now 10 years is very, very important in HR terms, because some of the organisational changes that will be required take a long time to actually really take effect. So using this chart, what we want to do is have a dialogue, ideally with the chief executive or the executive team, about what they think is going to happen in the future. Now, one of the things we want to ask them is, what do they think will happen to either the market value or share price or profit performance of the organisation? And we don't need actual numbers for this. We just need to produce a simple graph that says, is it going up? Is it going down? How much is it going up by, etc. This is a view of the future over 10 years. And what we're saying here is, this is what we think, for example, will be the company's market value if we don't introduce an HR strategy. This is if we just carry on doing what we're doing. If we do introduce an HR strategy here in year 0, what we would expect is it would take a bit of time to really kick in and have some effect. It might take 2, 3, 4 years. But once it does, we would expect to see a significant increase in the company's market value. And now we can talk about this as an HR business strategy. In other words, the business strategy on its own is graph number 1, but the HR business integrated strategy is graph number 2. Why does it have to go up by so much? Well, if we look at the history of Toyota, it has left many of its competitors way behind by having a much better HR strategy than they have had. If we can't talk about the general situation in terms of market value, the key question we normally should ask is, what's going to happen to revenue over the next 10 years and what's going to happen to cost over the next 10 years? We could also ask questions about quality, or quality of product, quality of service. But you can't draw these graphs unless you actually have measures to put them in place. As with many diagrams and tools and techniques in the Consummate Professional series, some of these look very theoretical. But the one you've just seen I've used many times with chief executives, finance directors and all sorts of people. And immediately they either engaged in the process of thinking about the future, or you realise how much resistance there is to even the possibility of looking further than maybe a year or 2 down the line. But the reason we need to look, say, 10 years down the line is they're the sort of timescales we need to consider when we're thinking about HR strategy. And we need to bring the chief executive, the finance director and other people along with us in this thinking. Because if they don't anticipate what might happen, then they're going to always require a lot of transactional HR work, grievances, disciplinaries, changing the organisation structure, redrafting job descriptions and job specifications, a lot of transactional work and a lot of hassle and a lot of grief. So again, trying to predict what's going to happen and coming up with the most flexible way of coping with that is a key part of any HR strategy. HR strategy is a very dynamic concept. It is never fixed in concrete. It is never fixed in a particular time. It is always future looking, and we always need to be as flexible and adaptable as possible. One of my MBA students asked me to go through this slide with their own chief executive after the end of the day when we just finished part of the MBA program. So I went to this business and sat down with him and the chief executive, and we tried this idea out. And the very short version of quite a long story was that I said to the chief executive, so let's start drawing the graph and let's look at your revenue predictions and let's look at your cost predictions. And basically the chief exec said, revenue I'm happy with, cost I'm happy with, and I don't really think there'll be much significant change in that. So it was all a very friendly meeting, and then I said, what about customer service or quality of service? And he said, now you're talking. He said, that is something that keeps me awake at night. So I said, well, let's draw a line for customer service over the next 10 years. And he said, well, we can't draw any lines. I don't measure it at the moment. So something as simple as measuring something that's keeping the chief exec awake at night starts to engage them in the process. And that turned out to be a very fruitful discussion, and one that the chief exec could really start to see some of the implications of thinking about things from a strategic HR perspective. Actually, what we're trying to do here is take a very complex and dynamic process of trying to strategize, trying to formulate strategy for an organisation. It is never going to be simple, and it just will not lend itself to simplistic solutions. It is always going to be slightly messy. There are always going to be competing and conflicting views until hopefully the organisation comes up with a coherent strategy, one that hangs together as well as possible. But it is a messy business, and this final slide just looks at how messy it is. But this slide has one simple aim. It's basically to say that the thinking about the HR and learning implications should be brought right to the front of the strategizing process. When the strategy is being formulated in its very earliest stages, in its very inception, somebody should be at the table injecting into those discussions the human resource management perspective. What are we going to do with our people as part of this change process? Producing a business strategy is always going to be a complex, messy business, and this slide is intentionally meant to look very messy. It's based on the idea of Mars deciding some years ago that rather than just being a chocolate and confectionery company, it wanted to move into chocolate ice cream bars. And it just poses the question, what sort of thought processes did the organisation go through to actually produce this strategy? And while we're doing this, we need to ask the question, where did HR, or at least HR strategic thinking, fit into this whole thinking process? The probably start of the process was the basic question, why do we want to sell ice cream? What sort of ice cream do we want to sell? What sort of markets do we want to be in? And when these questions were going through their minds, somebody must have thought about the research and development angle, the financial, commercial plans they'd have to put in place, the sales and marketing plans that they might have to produce to actually sell ice cream bars. Then at some stage, at a more operational level, they would say, how many ice cream bars do we have to sell? By when? To fit in with our financial plan. And eventually there would be an operating plan that said, this is how many people have to go out there and sell this number of ice cream bars at this margin to produce this profit. There'd be logistics plans, production plans that would also have to fall into place to make sure this all came to fruition. And the really big question is, when would somebody put an HR plan together? Would it be after all the big decisions are made, or would it actually be right at the beginning? One of the obvious questions you'd ask right at the beginning is, do our people who sell chocolate want to sell ice cream? Well, as I said at the beginning of this module, HR strategy is the module. It's the one that really sits above all of the others in the Consummate Professional series. It's not easy. It takes many years to develop the skills required to do the job really properly. And you might be thinking, well, is it worth all the trouble, all the effort? Are we ever going to achieve anything like a decent HR strategy? Well, you could take that choice, but I'm not sure that would be very professional. So I think HR strategy is worth putting all the effort you can into, and the more you develop your skills in this area, you'll become a very, very marketable commodity.